One November night in 2012, police walked into a scene that seemed unthinkable. A foster daughter had stabbed her foster mother more than 150 times.
Is gonna be there?
Yes, she's on the floor.
On the floor? Is she awake?
No, I don't know what.
She came out into the hallway, had the actual knife in her hand. The officers confronted her, got her down on the floor.
But the question wasn't just how, it was why. Behind that horror was a tangled story of neglect, trust, and hidden manipulation.
The relationship between me and my parents, it was rocky. It was very distant.
If you've ever wondered how a home that looks safe can hide something darker, or how a vulnerable teen can be drawn into a nightmare, this story will strike a chord. Today we'll uncover the 911 call, the shocking investigation, and the betrayal that turned protection into danger. Stay with me, this gets darker. Sabrina's early life and foster system journey into a home where both parents struggled with drug and alcohol addiction. The air was often thick with arguments, the sound of bottles clinking in the sink, the heaviness of days that blurred into nights. In that kind of environment, childhood isn't measured by birthdays or school trips. It's measured by moments of survival, staying quiet when tempers rose, finding a safe corner to disappear into. Her grandmother eventually stepped in, offering what she could, a bed, some warmth, a steadier voice in the chaos. But this was never meant to be permanent. For Sabrina, it was a pause in a life already set to move again. When her grandmother's health began to fail, the decision came quickly. The girl who had been passed from one set of arms to another would now be placed into the care of strangers. At 14, she entered the Emma K. Receiving Home, a place meant to be a gateway for children in crisis. To the outside world, it was a safety net. Inside, it was a holding station, a place where kids learned not to unpack too much because you never knew how long you'd be there. Sabrina learned that lesson quickly. She became good at adapting, good at reading the room, and better at hiding the feeling that no one truly wanted her. The years that followed were a carousel of addresses and faces. Foster parents with strict rules, others with barely any. Some wanted to help, others just wanted the check that came with taking her in. She became skilled at masking disappointment, smiling when she had to, staying quiet when her presence was met with sighs instead of hellos. By the summer of 2011, Sabrina's path led her to Willoughby Hills, Ohio, to the home of Kevin and Lisa Canel. The house looked like something from a picture book, a tidy lawn, a welcoming porch, light spilling from the kitchen in the evening. She was told they were a good match, the kind of couple who could provide stability. They had 2 daughters already, Megan, 13, and Haley, only 3. At first, the Canel household felt like a place where she could finally settle. The rhythm of family dinners, the hum of a home that wasn't in constant chaos, the small rituals of belonging, all of it felt new. For once, she wasn't moving from bed to bed or house to house. She began school in the district, started making friends, and for a moment it seemed like the story might turn in her favor. But belonging isn't just about where you live, it's about how you're seen. And beneath the surface of those early months, quiet tensions were already forming. Tensions that would grow slowly and steadily until one November morning when everything came apart. Life in the Canel household. In the beginning, Sabrina found herself falling into the Canel family's routines with surprising ease. She helped Megan with homework sometimes, watched cartoons with little Haley, and even began to talk to Lisa in the kitchen while dinner was being made. Kevin often worked long hours as a truck driver, but when he was home, the house felt lighter. He had an easy way of joking with her, of making her feel like she was part of something. But the balance inside the Canel home was fragile. The daughters had known nothing else but their parents' love, while Sabrina was still learning how to navigate it. Lisa, the mother, was protective of her children. Sabrina noticed it in small ways at first. A bigger portion of dessert on Megan's plate, more patience when Haley misbehaved. It wasn't cruel or blatant. It was subtle, but to someone who had spent her life on the margins, those differences were impossible to miss. The warmth she'd felt in those first months began to cool. Lisa became less tolerant of mistakes. A forgotten chore brought sharper words, a missed curfew, and icy silence. Kevin, on the other hand, often sided with Sabrina when disagreements arose. He told her she was doing fine, that she just needed to ignore the little things. She began to see him as the safe point in the house, the person she could go to when she felt misunderstood. Still, she tried to prove herself to Lisa. She kept her grades up, avoided trouble at school, and offered to help around the house. But it was never quite enough. Sabrina's memories of neglect made every perceived slight cut deeper. Where Megan could roll her eyes and walk away, Sabrina carried the sting with her. In public, the Canels appeared like any other family, smiling at school events, taking photos during the holidays, and keeping up the image of unity. But inside, the house felt divided into unspoken alliances. Lisa and her daughters on one side, Sabrina and Kevin on the other. There were also moments when the separation wasn't just emotional. Lisa would plan outings for her daughters without inviting Sabrina, framing it as mother-daughter time. Sabrina didn't argue, but the message sank in. She was part of the household, but not entirely part of the family. Kevin's kindness became a double-edged comfort. His support made the tension with Lisa bearable, but it also created a dangerous dependency. She began to lean on him more, confiding in him about her frustrations. In return, he encouraged her to keep trying, to be the bigger person. What Sabrina didn't realize, or maybe didn't want to see, was that this dynamic was setting the stage for something far more insidious. The lines between loyalty, protection, and control were already starting to blur. And in a home where trust was fragile, blurred lines can become fault lines. It wouldn't be long before those fault lines cracked wide open. The day before the murder, November 15, 2012, began like any other Thursday in the Canel home. The sky outside was overcast, the kind of gray Ohio morning that seems to seep into your bones. Sabrina woke up, got ready for school, and walked the familiar route to the bus. At school, there was nothing unusual. Classes, hallway chatter, and the quiet comfort of routine. If anyone had been watching her closely, they would have seen nothing to hint at what the next 24 hours would bring. That afternoon, she came home to the warm, savory smell of hamburger helper simmering in the kitchen. Lisa was at the stove, stirring the pot, and Egan was sitting nearby, scrolling through her phone. Haley toddled in and out of the room, clutching a stuffed toy. Dinner was a mix of small talk and silence, the kind of family moment that could pass for normal in any home. Kevin ate quickly, kissed his daughters goodbye, and headed out for work. After he left, the atmosphere shifted not dramatically, but just enough for Sabrina to feel it. Lisa moved briskly through the kitchen, tidying up without much conversation. Megan went to her room. Haley stayed close to her mother. Sabrina, left to herself, retreated to the desk in the living room to work on a school project. The hours slid by quietly, the sound of typing, the low hum of the television somewhere in the house. Occasionally, Lisa would pass through the room without looking at her. Sabrina noticed but didn't comment. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence was easier than confrontation. By midnight, she was still at her desk, headphones on, trying to finish the last bits of her homework. A dull ache began to build behind her eyes, the familiar throb of a headache she'd been getting for months. Around 12:30 a.m., she decided to get some ibuprofen. She headed upstairs toward the master bedroom, where Kevin and Lisa kept their medicine. Later, in the interrogation room, this would be the point in her story where her memory began to fray. She would recall going into the bathroom, shaking pills into her hand, and then nothing. She'd say she didn't remember if Lisa was awake, if they spoke, or what happened after. But the physical evidence would tell a different story. There was no sign of forced entry in the house, no broken windows, no footprints outside. Whatever happened next began right there between Sabrina and Lisa in the quiet of the early morning hours. The gap in her memory, whether real or constructed, left a shadow over those final moments before the violence began. A shadow that would later be filled by witness accounts, forensic reports, and the voice of a terrified child calling 911. By 1 o'clock a.m., the house was still. Megan was asleep upstairs, Haley was in her room, Lisa was in the master bedroom. And Sabrina was there too, standing in the doorway with a bottle of pills in one hand, and soon after a knife in the other. The day had ended like so many others. The night would end like none before it. The murder and 911 call. The first sound that broke the stillness was not a scream, but the sharp, panicked intake of breath that comes when something shifts from normal to nightmare in an instant. In the early hours of November 16, 2012, 13-year-old Megan awoke to a noise she couldn't place. Hurried footsteps, a thud, a muffled cry. She slipped out of bed and stepped into the hallway. From there, she saw it. Lisa, her mother, was on the floor of the master bedroom. Sabrina was over her, a 15-inch knife flashing in her hand. Megan froze, the image searing itself into her memory before instinct took over. She ran to the nearest phone. 911, what's your emergency? The voice on the other end was calm, professional. Megan was trembling, nearly breaking apart. My mom! What is going on? She has a knife. Who has a knife? My sister.
Can you see where you are?
We're on the freeway, but we're going the wrong way.
The dispatcher's voice stayed steady, but the urgency was unmistakable. Where is your sister? Megan's voice cracked. Quick! The operator kept her talking while officers were dispatched, her words spilling over themselves in panic. Somewhere in the background, the sounds of the struggle carried faintly, heavy breathing, the dull thud of movement, the metallic scrape of the knife being pulled free again and again. By the time police arrived, the air inside the Canel home felt thick with copper and fear. They found Sabrina standing in the hallway just outside the bedroom. Her clothes were soaked, her hands slick with blood. The knife hung loosely from her grip, the blade dripping. Inside the master bedroom, the scene was brutal. Lisa lay motionless on the floor, her body marked by more than 150 stab wounds. The walls bore small splatters where the blade had met no resistance. The carpet beneath her was dark and heavy with blood. Sabrina didn't run, she didn't shout, she didn't fight as officers closed in and ordered her to drop the weapon. They noted she seemed dazed, her eyes unfocused, as though she were waking from a dream. When they cuffed her, she didn't resist. Later, it would be revealed that Sabrina herself had several stab wounds, not deep enough to be life-threatening, but enough to suggest she had either fought back against Lisa's attempts to defend herself or injured herself in the frenzy. Those wounds, along with her shock, were part of why she remained at the scene instead of fleeing. Megan, still on the phone with the 911 dispatcher when the police arrived, was ushered out quickly, shielded from the worst of the view, but she had already seen enough. Her voice on that call would become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in the case.
You're gonna have to take a deep breath. I cannot understand you. Why is your mom gonna die? What happened?
The sound of innocence colliding with unthinkable violence. Paramedics confirmed what was already obvious. Lisa Canel was gone. The time of death would be marked in the early morning hours, but for those in the house, time had already stopped. As Sabrina was led outside into the cold pre-dawn air, the street was beginning to fill with flashing lights. Neighbors peered from behind curtains and cracked open doors. To them, the Canels had always seemed like a normal family. But normal had bled out on the floor of the master bedroom, and the reasons why would only grow darker as the investigation began.
Now first, like always, be sure to hit the like button down below. It helps us out tremendously with the reach of this video. Thank you.
The interrogation. Sabrina's first stop after leaving the Canel home wasn't a jail cell, but a hospital room. The cuts on her hands and arms needed cleaning and stitches. She sat quietly while nurses worked, her gaze fixed somewhere far away. No tears, no questions, just a blank stare that made it hard to tell whether she was in shock or simply choosing not to speak. Within hours, she was escorted to an interrogation room at the Willoughby Hills Police Department. The room was small and bare, with just a table, 3 chairs, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights. She was 17, old enough in Ohio to be tried as an adult for a crime like this, and the detectives knew it. One of them, Detective Jim Vital, began by explaining her rights. "You're being suspected of being involved in a homicide," he said, his tone careful but direct. She nodded, initiated where he told her to, and asked for a glass of water. Her voice was calm, almost casual, as though she were agreeing to fill out school paperwork instead of facing a murder charge. They started with small, open questions. "What do you remember from last night?" Sabrina recounted the early part of her evening with precision, finishing homework, having hamburger helper for dinner, and returning to her project afterward. She described Kevin leaving for work, Megan retreating to her room, and Haley playing nearby. Every detail came smoothly until the timeline reached her trip to the master bedroom. "I went in for some ibuprofen," she said, shrugging slightly. "My head hurt. What happened after that?" "I don't know. I don't remember." The detectives exchanged a glance. She could recall what shelf the medicine was on, the color of the label, and even the number of shelves in the cabinet, but not what happened next. They pressed her gently, then more firmly. "Did she see Lisa? Did they speak? Was there an argument?" Each time she gave the same answer. "I don't know." They asked about her mental health. She told them she'd been diagnosed with ADHD at age 4, as well as oppositional defiant disorder, depression, anxiety, and bipolar disorder. Yes, she'd had blackouts during fights in the past. No, she hadn't taken any drugs or alcohol recently. The implication was clear. Maybe this was another blackout. But the pattern was hard to ignore. She remembered everyone else's movements that night. Kevin's goodbye, Megan's bedtime, Haley's location, yet her actions became a blur, exactly where the violence began. The detectives shifted focus. How was her relationship with Lisa? Sabrina hesitated, then admitted they'd never been close. She accused Lisa of emotional and mental abuse, of restraining her during an argument over an iPod, but she insisted she'd never wanted to hurt her. Then came questions about Kevin. Her tone softened. "Kevin and I are cool," she said. "He's the one who helps me out." She described how he'd encouraged her, told her not to worry about small conflicts with Lisa. The detectives let the silence stretch, hoping she might fill it. Instead, she stared at the table. They brought up Megan, her eyewitness account, and the fact that officers had seen Sabrina with the knife in hand. Still, she denied remembering any of it. It was a standoff of sorts, her wall of "I don't know" against their mounting evidence. By the end of the interview, they had no confession, but they had something else. A growing suspicion that Sabrina's story was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. A puzzle in which Kevin Canel's shadow was beginning to loom larger. The shadow of Kevin Canel. When Kevin Canel returned home on the morning of the murder, police were already there. His wife was gone. His foster daughter was in custody. Any husband, any father might have collapsed under the weight of such a scene. But Kevin didn't. Officers noted that he was calm, not detached exactly, but strangely composed for a man who had just lost his wife in such a brutal way. He asked questions, but not the kind they expected. He didn't want to know if Lisa had suffered or if there had been any chance to save her. Instead, he seemed more curious about the sequence of events, the timeline. Within days, he began collecting on Lisa's life insurance. He paid off the house, bought new cars, invested in a property in Florida, and even took flying lessons. His sudden, almost celebratory spending stood out, especially to investigators who were beginning to wonder just how much he had known before that night. In the weeks that followed, police invited Kevin in for questioning. He didn't come alone. His lawyer sat beside him, intercepting questions, steering the conversation away from anything touching on the night of November 16th. "Let's stick to his wife's work," the lawyer instructed when detectives asked about what had been happening at the house before Kevin left that night. It was frustrating. Detectives could see it in Kevin's body language, the way he avoided eye contact, the way his gaze dropped to the table whenever his wife's name came up. But without direct evidence, suspicion was all they had. The truth was, Kevin had been on their radar even before the murder. Neighbors had mentioned marital tension. Friends said he'd spoken about separating from Lisa, but with a 3-year-old daughter in the picture, custody would be a fight. And then there was Sabrina, a teenager already isolated in the family, who seemed to view Kevin as her main source of support. To detectives, the possibility was becoming harder to ignore. What if the murder hadn't been a spontaneous act of rage? What if it had been planted, nurtured, and set in motion by someone else entirely? Still, proving that meant breaking through Sabrina's wall of silence. For months, the case moved forward in parallel tracks. Sabrina sat in jail, awaiting trial. Kevin moved on with his life, outwardly untouched by the legal storm swirling around him. Investigators kept watching, waiting for something to crack. They didn't have to wait forever. 6 months after Lisa's murder, a shift came. Sabrina, perhaps tired of her isolation, perhaps realizing she had been left to carry the weight alone, agreed to speak to prosecutors in a setting known as a proffer. It was her chance to tell the full story, and in doing so, to point a finger squarely at the man she had once trusted the most. What she said would change everything. The confession and proffer. 6 months after the murder, Sabrina Zunich sat in a quiet conference room, facing a prosecutor instead of a detective. This wasn't another interrogation. It was a proffer, her chance to speak fully and honestly, with the understanding that her words couldn't be. It was a 911 call from a child, reporting something no one would have to see. Inside a quiet urban home, a mother lay bleeding. A sister stood nearby, a knife still in her hand. Her name was Sabrina Zunich. She wasn't a stranger to this house. She'd eaten at its table, slept under its roof, and its rooms her own. But on something shattered. Hours that followed, questions would grow darker than the act itself. Was this desperation or the careful work of someone else's hands? Hidden just out of sight? Sabrina's early life in foster system into a home where both parents struggled with drug and alcohol addiction. The air was often thick with arguments, the sound of bottles clinking, the heaviness of days that blurred into nights. In that kind of childhood isn't measured by birthdays or school trips. It's measured by moments of survival, quiet when tempers rose, finding a safe corner to disappear into. Her grandmother eventually stepped in, offering what she could, some warmth, a steadier voice in the chaos. But this was never be permanent. For Sabrina, it was a pause in a life already set to move in. When her mother's health began to fail, quickly. The girl who had been passed from one set of arms to another would now be placed into the care of strangers. At 14, she entered the McKay Receiving Home, a plan to be a gateway for children in crisis. To the outside world, it was a safety net. Inside, it was a holding station, a place where kids learned not to pack too much, because you never knew how long you'd be there. Sabrina learned a lesson quickly. She became good at adapting, good at reading the room, good at hiding the feeling that no one truly wanted her. That followed were a carousel of addresses and foster parents with strict rules, with barely any. Some wanted to help, others just wanted the check that came with taking her in. She became skilled at masking disappointment, smiling when she had to, staying quiet when her presence met with sighs instead of hellos. By the summer of 2011, Sabrina's path led her to Willoughby Hills, Ohio, to the home of Kevin and Lisa Canel. The house looked like something from a picture book. A tidy lawn, a welcoming porch, light spilling from the kitchen in the evening. She was told they were a good match, the kind of couple who could provide stability. They had 2 daughters already, Megan, 13, and Haley, only 3. At first, the household felt like a place where she could finally settle. The room of family dinners, the hum of a home, how their relationship had shifted from inappropriate touches to outright abuse, and finally to the deadly proposition that ended Lisa's life. They saw excerpts from over 1,500 messages between them, some sexual, others alluding to solving problems once and for all. The defense countered by portraying Sabrina as volatile and dangerous on her own. They leaned heavily on her mental health diagnoses and her history of conflict, suggesting she didn't need Kevin's influence to commit the crime. But the prosecution reminded jurors that influence doesn't require a hand on the weapon. It can be as simple and as devastating as planting the idea and feeding it until it feels like the person's own. Witnesses described Kevin's behavior after Lisa's death, how quickly he moved to collect her life insurance, and how easily he spent it on property, vehicles, and personal luxuries. It was not grief they saw in him, they said, but relief. The verdict was clear, guilty on all counts. Kevin was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after decades, though for many who followed the case, parole seemed unthinkable. Sabrina faced her trial soon after. Despite her cooperation, the brutality of her actions could not be ignored. She was convicted of aggravated murder and given life in prison with parole eligibility after 30 years. When the gavel fell for the last time, the courtroom was left with an emptiness. Lisa was gone. Her daughters had lost both parents, one to the grave, the other to prison. The foster system, which had promised protection, had instead placed Sabrina in the path of someone who would use her as a weapon. The law had done its work, but justice felt far from whole. In the end, the murder of Lisa Canel was not just one act of violence, but the collapse of an entire trust. A mother lost her life, 2 daughters lost their safety, and a foster child, already shaped by neglect, was drawn into something darker than she could have imagined. The system meant to protect her had delivered her into the hands of a predator. What remains are the echoes, the chilling 911 call, the image of a knife in the dim hallway, and the knowledge that sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from outside the home, but from within.